See, this is a problem with
Okay,
some Shakespeare
why
biographies.
can't we account for the extraordinary, and it is extraordinary, and Price has shown that, extraordinary lack of evidence, that she compares 24 other writers of the period who all do have a literary paper trail, and he has none.
Shakespeare does, actually, and Diana Price is wrong. And Stanley,
Oh,
can we hear from Stanley Wells, co-editor of the book, on evidence for Shakespeare?
Well, there's masses of evidence from the publications that as Ross says, that somebody called Shakespeare, wrote plays, wrote poems. There are commendatory verses to somebody called Shakespeare. There is Ben Jonson's discussions of William Drummond of Hawthornden, in which he talks about Shakespeare as a man. There is Ben Jonson's testimony that he loved Shakespeare, beside idolatry. There's a lot of evidence about Shakespeare in that play.
I have huge problems with the anti-Shakespearean perspective that dismisses posthumous evidence like that. And this phrase, in his lifetime, keeps popping up. It matters not a jot. Funeral monuments are normally made after someone has died, for goodness sakes.
Of course they are.
And, you know, if we went on the evidence of a funeral monument, we might say, well, Jane Austen wasn't a writer, because it doesn't mention the fact that she was a writer on a monument. It does on Shakespeare's. Yes. He's compared to Virgil. He's compared to Socrates and Nestor.
Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon.
Yeah.
Yes.
The man who was buried in Stratford.
I agree, but isn't the lack of personal evidence curious? Isn't
no,
that?
I don't think it is.
You don't think that is?
Ross, what do we mean by personal evidence?
Well, evidence of someone.
The tone of it.
Well, just the fact that he appears to move in those writing circles, and that, you know, I mean, even Ben Jonson. Now, Ben Jonson sounds like he did know him personally. I agree, right? None of that is published until after his death, but he sounds like he knows him personally. But he said, on the one hand, he's saying marvelous things about him. On the other hand, he's quite disparaging.
Well, he was a friendly rival, wasn't he?
Well, he's, you know, you can. There's many ways of reading the evidence, and another way of reading it is that he was actually talking about two different people, and that is certainly the way that some people have.
I like the fact that a Stratfordian friend, Richard Field, published Shakespeare, and that he's mentioned in Cymbeline with Richard Duchamp. And yes, I think that Richard Field moved in exalted circles, and he was a very important publisher.
He published for Lord Burleigh, you know, and which would be, you know, work very well for the Marlowe story, because Marlowe is known to have worked for Lord Burleigh as well.
This is the problem here, isn't it? Work very well for the Marlowe story, as if everything is just detective fiction, which with you know,
well, it just, you know, well, it's all about taking different narratives. You take the orthodox narrative, and, you know, I look through at the Marlowe narrative. There are, you know, there's the Oxford narrative. There are other narratives, and what interests me is how different pieces of evidence add up to or join into these various narratives. I think that Richard Field's reference in Cymbeline is very interesting, because in that case it's actually Cloten who's dead with his head chopped off, and he's referred to throughout the play as Clot. And so it's Richard Field is a clot. Is an entirely different way of looking at he's saying, here is someone who's associated my name with Stratford. Thanks, Richard Field. I think you're a clot. I'm not saying that's true at all. I'm just saying here's a different way of reading the evidence.
See, all of this in front of us, Stanley, will all mangle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it will all through the sense of these quartos have name on the title page. And this is very good evidence, because all of these are different publishers, different printers. We're seeing before as a list of plays, but it's a hugely complex strata of information which make these publications possible. People knew each other, people talked.
But no one seems to have known William Shakespeare, the writer. No one seems to.
But Richard Barfield did, for example. Richard Barfield writes a commentary.
Yeah, but that's a totally impersonal reference. He's writing to the author, William Shakespeare.
How do you know he didn't know him?
Well, what I'm saying is that these are impersonal references. There's no evidence of a personal friendship in these references. They are standard Elizabethan, you know, commendations. He's William Shakespeare. No one at all disputes the fact that the name William Shakespeare is on all of these plays.
But
no one disputes that.
All of this argument really is you're wanting to gainsay these references to Shakespeare in his lifetime, to say that he's not the William Shakespeare Stratford-upon-Avon, and why? Why do you want to do that? Why don't you want it to be Shakespeare Stratford-upon-Avon?
This is an interesting thing about your approach, and I know James Shapiro's as well, that why don't you want it to be? And what is it about my psychology or even my pathology that makes me doubt Shakespeare? You're always looking at, I mean, there's 2 chapters devoted to Delia Bacon in your book, and looking at the psychology of Delia Bacon and why does she doubt? Because I appreciate this is something that you don't understand, but I have to tell you, the answer is that the evidence isn't sufficient, that the evidence doesn't add up, that there isn't the evidence for Shakespeare as a writer, Shakespeare Stratford as a writer, that there is for other writers of the period.
Well, there is, for example, there is the fact that people visited Stratford soon after Shakespeare died to look at his monument because they knew he was a writer. There is the manuscript of William Bass's elegy on William Shakespeare, which is headed William Shakespeare died in Stratford-upon-Avon, the town of his birth, 1616, and that is an elegy which refers specifically to Shakespeare as a great tragedian. It uses the word tragedian, which might mean either an actor or a writer or a
So
writer.
you see, the alternative scenario is that all of the evidence, and we've only just touched on a little bit of it, the most likely outcome of that evidence is that the plays were written by Shakespeare Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, if you want to rewrite history, if you want to rewrite evidence, if you want to pitch in and say, actually, let's look again, let's tell a different story, that is something you can do. But please don't expect people who are interested in the truth of history and what the past tells us through documentation to go along with it.
Well, actually, I have to say, the people that you call anti-Shakespeareans, who are actually non-Stratfordians in my book, they're very interested in the truth, they're very interested in the evidence, and it's not about rewriting the evidence, it's about looking at it in a different perspective.
And dismissing it. Shakespeare in schools is an interesting one.
I have to say, you dismiss some evidence as well. I see dismissal of evidence on both sides.
Shakespeare in schools is an interesting one because for the school record it doesn't exist, but that's not unusual among grammar schools. I think the school records in Stratford actually only start in 1800. And this is a magisterial chapter by Carol Rutter of Warwick University, in which, of course, all of these chapters have different purposes within a critical mass of evidence which the book is bringing together. And Carol wrote this chapter in part to demonstrate we didn't have to go to university or be an aristocrat to write Shakespeare, and that all you needed was a really good grammar school education of the kind which was available in Stratford and had been available for many, many years before the school was properly given its charter by Edward VI, and that the likeliest outcome is that Shakespeare went there with many others. The records don't survive, but the body of work shows an educated school mind.
A correlation between.
I have no problem at all with the idea that the author of these works went to an Elizabethan grammar school. And I think it's very likely that Shakespeare of Stratford went to the grammar school in Stratford, even though there's no evidence to support that. It seems a reasonable assumption that he did have some schooling at the grammar school, given the position of his father. What Carol Rutter's chapter proves, as far as I'm concerned, is that the author of those works had experience of being a grammar school boy. And I don't have any problem at all with that.